Welcome back to the deep dive.
It's good to be back.
Today, we are tackling a really big concept, a phrase that I think for many people is just loaded with fear.
Oh, absolutely. The moment you say familiar spirit, people immediately have an image in their head.
They do. And it's usually something pretty dark, right? Devils, demons, some kind of external force that's out to get you.
For centuries, that's been the dominant reading. It has created this very stark dualism in Western thought, a universe split between good guys and these terrifying external entities.
And that narrative has fueled so much fear, so much superstition.
And a lot of, frankly, unnecessary anxiety about things we can't see.
Exactly. This idea that you have to be constantly on guard against some cosmic enemy. But today, we're diving into some source material, mainly the work of Dr. Roy E. Richmond, that argues this is all based on a profound misunderstanding.
A mistranslation, really.
Right, a mistranslation. And that the original intent was never about external enemies at all.
So our mission today is to peel back those layers, the layers of translation, of cultural fear, and get to what the ancient Hebrew writers were actually talking about.
We're moving the conversation away from spells and demons.
And into the internal world of consciousness, of awareness.
The big aha moment we're going for here is this shift from what the source calls old awareness, which is that consciousness rooted in fear and separation, to awakened awareness.
Which is consciousness aligned with, well, with the source of life itself. The texts call it Elohim Ruwach breath, the divine animating intelligence.
And to kind of cushion the shock of this shift, we need to start with the evidence, the word itself.
The foundational Hebrew word. Because when you trace this phrase back, the word that gets translated as familiar spirit has nothing to do with anything spooky.
No smoke, no sulfur.
No, it's about a hollow container, an empty vessel.
An empty wineskin.
An empty wineskin.
That's the image. And that right there, that simple physical object, is the key that unlocks this whole thing. It just forces you to ask, how do we get from an empty bottle to a demon?
And that's the journey we're on today. It shows you the power of interpretation to really shift meaning, to move from a teaching about inner discernment to a rule about external forces.
We want to put that power, that discernment back in your hands. Okay, so let's start at the root, section 1. Deconstructing the Hebrew, the empty vessel. To really get this, we have to start with the word they actually used.
We have to. The entire traditional view hangs on the translation of one single Hebrew word. It's olb. That's spelled aleph av bet, and it's pronounced olf.
And this word isn't abstract or mystical in its origin.
Not at all. It's physical, almost visceral. The core meaning of olb is, like we said, a wineskin, a bladder, a hollow container, an empty vessel.
Okay, so a physical object defined by its emptiness.
Exactly. And then you think about the secondary meanings that flow from that. What does an empty container do? It resonates. It echoes.
All right, if you blow across the top of an empty bottle, you get that hollow sound.
That sound is the of. So the word also carries this idea of something that echoes, that mutters from within, a hollow whispering.
That is such a concrete, tangible image. So how on earth did we get from a hollow, echoing jug to a medium possessed by a demon?
Well, it happened over time as cultures and beliefs shifted. The ancient Hebrew writers were using these really sophisticated metaphors for states of consciousness.
They were talking about psychology, not demonology.
Precisely. But later translators, who were living in cultures steeped in superstition and necromancy, they encountered this word, this hollow sound, and they interpreted it through their own literal lens. They heard hollow voice and assumed.
It must be a voice from somewhere else, a ghost, a demon channeling through a person.
Yes. They missed the metaphor entirely. The original point wasn't that the person was a vehicle for a demon. The point was that the person speaking was themselves empty.
Empty of truth, empty of real substance.
Exactly. They were just echoing cultural programming. The source material is very clear that this term was often used to describe, well, teachers of religiosity.
People who looked the part.
Yeah.
Who sounded authoritative.
Right. They might have used all the right words, all of the sacred language, but there was no inner substance, no real life, no breath behind the words. It was just an echo.
And this gets to that core idea we wanted to focus on. These teachers were like clouds without rain. They look promising, they look full, but they bring no actual nourishment.
That is the perfect analogy for it. They're just hollow vessels. So the warning in Scripture was never, don't talk to demons. It was, don't seek life-giving water from an empty container.
Don't seek Logos truth, that ultimate divine guidance from someone who is operating from a void.
That's the metaphysical core. The term ab describes a state of empty awareness. It's the psychological condition of someone who has forgotten their oneness with the divine and is just, a walking, talking echo chamber of inherited traditions and fears.
And that's why the warning is so strong, because relying on them is relying on nothing. It's a spiritual dead end.
It connects so perfectly with that counsel from Isaiah. He said, "Cease you from man whose breath is in his nostrils."
Meaning sensory awareness.
Exactly. Isaiah is telling us to stop relying on guidance that is purely external, that's bound to the five senses. If the spirit or breath you're listening to is just what a person takes in through their nose, through what they see and hear in the physical world, then you're listening to the hollow wineskin.
It's an instruction to trust the deep inner knowing, not just the chatter of the external world.
And if the teachers you follow are just echoing the latest cultural fears, the latest tribal myths, rather than speaking from that deep inner place,
Then metaphysically, they are the familiar spirits.
and you just have to stop and think about the tragedy of this misinterpretation. I mean, the violence, the witch trials, the religious persecution, all of it stemming from turning a profound psychological teaching about inner discernment into a literal war against external evil.
Okay, that brings us right into section 2. If the familiar spirit isn't a demon, but an internal state, let's get really practical. What is the actual content of this hollow whisper?
Dr. Roy defines it very simply. A familiar spirit is the internal voice of old awareness speaking.
And we should define old awareness.
Right. The texts sometimes call it carnal awareness. It's that limited, ego-driven part of us that operates based on fear, on external input, and on the illusion that we are separate from everyone and everything else.
And the spirit is just that voice, that programming repeating itself.
On a loop. And the key is in the name. Familiar. It's insidious because it feels so normal. It feels comfortable even when it's making us miserable.
Why is that? Why do we get comfortable with a voice that causes us so much pain?
Because it's the only movie we've ever seen. It's the soundtrack we grew up with. It's familiar. And the components of this inner echo are things that I think everyone will recognize.
So let's list them out. What makes up this voice?
Okay, first and foremost, inherited belief systems whispering. These are the unquestioned assumptions about life, about money, about love, about your own self-worth that you absorbed from your family and your culture before you even had the ability to question them.
The idea that you have to work hard to deserve love,
Yeah.
or there's never enough to go around.
Exactly, those deep foundational fears, and that, of course, manifests as superstition, fear, separation, and guilt.
The voice of separation feels like the biggest one. The feeling that you're fundamentally flawed or disconnected from the good in the universe.
It's the root of it all, and it's magnified by religious conditioning and what the source calls inherited consequences thinking.
Meaning the idea that God or Elohim is an angry, judgmental bookkeeper in the sky just waiting for you to mess up so he can punish you.
Yes, if that's the belief system that's constantly replaying in your mind, that voice is the familiar spirit. It's a hollow, fear-driven noise. It is not the voice of breath, which is always one of wholeness and love.
So every time we operate from that core assumption that the universe is against us, or that we have to suffer to be worthy, we are, in that moment, consulting a familiar spirit.
You are. You're listening to ancestral doctrines, to tribal myths, to the grand illusion of an angry Elohim. And these ideas were poured into us like old wine into wineskins.
Ah, there's a metaphor again.
And that old wine, that old ideology just sits there and ferments, creating this toxic, familiar echo.
The source uses a great analogy for this, the old tape recorder.
It's perfect. It's just reruns of the same movie, the same old trauma responses, the same self-limiting beliefs playing over and over again. It's the tape recorder of carnal awareness just hitting repeat on its programming.
You can see this in something like imposter syndrome, can't you?
Absolutely. The person who feels like a fraud, even when they're successful, that feeling isn't based on the present reality. It's an echo from the past. A parent's criticism, a childhood failure, a cultural message of inadequacy, all replaying through an awareness that hasn't yet been filled.
Filled with what the source calls I exist consciousness. Let's define that. What is that?
I exist consciousness is the awakened state. It's the direct experiential knowing of your own beingness, your fundamental, inseparable connection to the divine. It's the I am that I am.
It's the state where there's no void.
There's no emptiness, and if there's no emptiness, there's no space for the old fears and the inherited beliefs to echo around in. You're full.
So allegorically, the familiar spirit is the empty container that hasn't yet been filled with the awareness of I exist.
That's it in a nutshell. The moment we forget who we really are and start looking for our value or our guidance from outside ourselves, from a job, from a relationship, from a religious system, from our past trauma, we turn ourselves into that empty wineskin.
And we become ruled by whatever was last poured into us.
Whether it was nourishing or toxic, the real tragedy of the familiar spirit isn't demonic possession, it's self-abandonment. It's giving up your inner authority to outdated programming.
And that leads us perfectly into section 3, because the symbolism of fullness versus emptiness is everything. The wineskin was never just a random object.
No, it was a core metaphor for capacity, for life itself. In the ancient Hebrew mind, a full wineskin was the picture of abundance. New wine in a new wineskin meant new life, new revelation, new vitality.
So the empty wineskin, is the exact opposite. It's a symbol of spiritual drought.
It represents a fundamental emptiness of awareness, a lack of true understanding, and it results in these echo chambers of fear we see everywhere.
It's such a powerful metaphor for hollow religious formula.
Oh, absolutely.
Systems that have all the outer trappings, the rituals, the doctrines, the beautiful buildings, but they're spiritually empty. They use the right words, but there's no life, no Elohim Ruwach breath inside them.
And that brings us back to those clouds without rain. That's the specific warning we wanted to highlight. Don't seek guidance from teachers who have no real spiritual understanding.
They look like they're about to deliver the Logos truth, but they're hollow. They promise nourishment, but they deliver nothing but more emptiness.
So the rule for discernment becomes incredibly practical. If the teaching you're receiving or the inner voice you're listening to uses all the right spiritual jargon, but the end result is that you feel more afraid, more guilty, or more separate,
then you're consulting the hollow vessel.
That's the test. The people in the scriptures who consulted familiar spirits were looking for Logos truth in an empty place. They were trying to get divine guidance from their own empty awareness or from a teacher who was just echoing tradition without any personal lived realization. They mistook the echo for the voice.
So the choice for you, the listener, becomes really simple. It's a binary choice.
It is. When your awareness is hollow, all you will ever get is an echo, a replay of the old fear-based programming. But when your awareness is awakened and full, you hear Elohim Ruwach breath, the clear, vital, life-giving guidance of oneness.
And this choice isn't just a theological point. It's the core principle of metaphysical living.
You can only give what you have. If you are spiritually empty, you will echo fear and superstition. If you are spiritually full, you transmit life and truth. The ancient writers weren't obsessed with fighting external enemies. They were obsessed with achieving internal fullness.
That refrain is every one of those prohibitions. They aren't restrictions. They're invitations.
They're invitations to look inside and ask a very honest question. Am I full right now, or am I just running on the echoes of what I've been told?
It's about taking responsibility for the state of your own inner vessel. A teacher or a system operating from a place of hollowness is, by definition, a dead end.
They aren't dangerous because they're malicious or evil in some cosmic sense. They're dangerous because they're empty, and they can only lead you to more emptiness, more separation.
Okay, with this lens firmly in place, the familiar spirit as empty awareness, let's move to section 4. This is where we apply this idea directly to the scriptures and see how consistently it fits. This is where it really starts to click.
Let's start with Leviticus. You have these passages like 19.31, 20.6, and 20.27. The traditional reading sees these as strict laws against occult practices.
But with our new understanding, the command is something more like, stop consulting the hollow voices, or stop turning toward guidance that comes from empty awareness.
Exactly. The core issue here is misplaced dependence. The writer is telling this emerging spiritual community, which is an allegory for the awakening self, to stop leaning on external, surface-level interpretations or the old superstitious traditions they came from.
So the familiar spirit in this context is the echo of ancestral superstition, the old tribal thinking that tries to define God with fear.
Yes. And that brings us to that really difficult verse, Leviticus 20.27, a man or woman with a familiar spirit shall be put to death. Literally, this sounds horrific.
It does. It sounds like a command for brutal physical violence. How does the metaphysical lens help us with that?
This is where we have to be willing to see the symbolism. In these kinds of transformative texts, the word for death, mut, is very often a metaphor. It doesn't mean physical execution. It means to separate from, to let go of, to cease functioning.
So the instruction isn't to kill the person. It's to put to death the state of consciousness itself.
Precisely. The empty, fear-based consciousness, the old awareness that hosts these echoes, that is what must be released. It must be allowed to fall away so it no longer functions as your ruling awareness.
You have to kill off that part of your identity.
You do, and it gets even deeper. The text says the community should be involved in the stoning.
What's the symbolism there?
The community is a metaphor for your own awakened awareness, the collective higher consciousness of your whole being. And stoning, the act of casting stones, symbolizes the deliberate act of the awakened mind, casting aside old, heavy, separate thoughts.
So it's an internal act of purification.
It's your unified self saying, this hollow, fear-based identity is poison, and we are casting it out. It transforms a barbaric law into a profound teaching on the necessity of ego death for spiritual awakening. You have to be ruthless with the thoughts that keep you empty.
Okay, now let's look at Deuteronomy 18.11. Here, the familiar spirit is listed alongside things like witchcraft and necromancy.
Right. And again, the traditionalist says, see, a list of forbidden magic. But metaphysically, this is a list of ways we lean on the old wine of superstition.
It's a warning against relying on the traditions of tribal religion, the hollow mutterings of our ancestors' fears. It's about not relying on systems built on emptiness.
And you have to remember the context of Deuteronomy. It's all about the transition from the wilderness to the promised land.
The wilderness being the old awareness.
The state of lack, fear, and separation. And the promised land is the awakened awareness of abundance and oneness.
So the familiar spirits are the voices of the wilderness murmuring in your ear.
That's it exactly. They are the constant nagging fears, the scarcity mindset, the old traumas that try to follow you out of the desert. Deuteronomy is saying, do not carry those hollow echoes with you. Don't let the programming you inherited speak louder than the living voice of breath inside you now.
So every time we hold ourselves back because of an old inherited belief about not being good enough, we're listening to that wilderness echo. We're consulting a familiar spirit.
You're choosing the wilderness over the promised land.
Wow. Okay, what about the most famous story of all? King Saul and the medium at Endor.
This one is so rich with symbolism. Saul the king isn't just a historical figure here. He represents the ruling awareness of the self.
He's the little illusionary, egoistic ruler within.
Perfect description. He's the part of us that craves certainty and external validation, but refuses to do the inner work of getting still and listening. Saul was outwardly religious, but inwardly he was hollow. He had already silenced the inner voice of breath long before he went looking for the medium.
Which is a key point. You only seek guidance from a hollow source when you've already cut yourself off from the true source inside.
That's the setup for his downfall. The woman with the familiar spirit, the medium, she symbolizes the last resort of a separated mind. She represents that old, reactive, fear-guided side of our own awareness, the part that holds all our past programming.
And Saul goes down into her cave.
This symbolism is powerful. The descent into the cave is Saul descending into the recesses of his own subconscious memories, into the cave of his old identity, his old fears, to look for an answer.
So he's not actually talking to the prophet Samuel.
He's talking to a mirror. He's talking to a projection of his own guilt and his own fear of doom, which the holy medium simply reflects back to him.
It confirms his worst fears, because his worst fears are all he brought with him.
That's the lesson. When your inner kingdom is ruled by the fearful ego, like Saul, you will inevitably look for answers in the empty places, and all you will ever get back is the echo of your own fear. Truth cannot be found there.
And that's what guaranteed his failure. Not an angry God, but the natural consequence of being completely disconnected from his own inner guidance.
Exactly. Now, finally, let's look at the two kings, Manasseh and Josiah. They represent the two paths for our ruling awareness.
Manasseh is the cautionary tale. He institutionalized all the fear-based, stuff, idol worship, empty rituals.
He represents the ruling mind that has turned completely toward separation. He made hollowness the state religion of his inner kingdom.
So the text says he suffered consequences for this.
It's vital to see that as the natural result of his choices. It's not a punishment from Elohim. If you enthrone fear and separation as your king, your inner kingdom will inevitably collapse into chaos and suffering. It's a law of consciousness.
And Josiah is the opposite, the blueprint for healing.
Yes. King Josiah comes in and cleans house. He removes the idols and those with familiar spirits. This is a beautiful metaphor for the process of inner cleansing that happens when awakened awareness finally takes the throne.
He's removing the thought forms built from fear.
He's purging the hollow echoes. He's tearing down the high places where we worship our limitations. Josiah's reforms are our personal work. to restore the inner temple by getting rid of every thought and belief that keeps us in a state of separation and fear.
Because the king, our ruling awareness, sets the tone for the entire inner kingdom.
And it requires constant vigilance. You have to keep asking, who is on the throne inside me right now? Is it the echo of my past, or is it the living voice of breath?
This just brings so much clarity to a concept that has been so frightening for so long.
Oh.
So let's move into our final section, section 5, and really synthesize this for the listener, bring it home to our current reality.
When you boil it all down, the true universal struggle that this phrase, familiar spirits, points to is actually very simple and very profound. It's the question we all face every single moment.
Will we live from the hollow echo of old awareness, or from the fullness of awakened awareness?
That's the choice. Every one of those scriptural passages, from Leviticus to Kings, is pointing to that fundamental decision.
So the familiar spirit isn't some shadowy entity hiding in the closet. It's the familiar, comfortable lie we keep telling ourselves.
Yes. A familiar lie, a familiar fear, a familiar superstition, a familiar tradition, a familiar sense of separation, and most of all, a familiar identity that no longer serves who we are becoming.
And we're told to stop consulting them, not because they're cosmically evil,
but because they're spiritually empty. They are the clouds without rain. They offer nothing of substance.
The only antidote, then, the only place to find that spiritual nourishment, is from a place of fullness.
The only true voice of Logos truth is the voice of Elohim Ruwach breath that you hear in your own inner sanctuary. And you might hear that truth reflected through what the texts call consecrated messengers, other people who are themselves full wineskins, speaking from that source.
But any other voice, any teacher, any system, any internal thought that generates fear and separation is just an echo from an outdated, empty vessel.
And this reframes so many other teachings. Think of Jesus telling the crowds, take heed to how you hear.
He wasn't warning them about being attacked by spirits.
No, he was inviting them to sharpen their inner ear. He was asking, are you listening to the voice of oneness within you? Or are you just passively accepting the external, fear-based static of the world? The real truth, he said, is like the voice behind you, the eternal guidance of Elohim Ruwach breath, always calling you back home to your true identity.
The conclusion, then, is really unavoidable. This entire concept is an internal guidepost.
It's a metaphor for living from the echoes of the past, for drawing our identity and guidance from programming that keeps us feeling small, empty, and separate. And the great shift, what some might call the resurrection of awareness, is just the movement from that empty echo chamber to the inner voice of one.
From the unawakened state to the awakened state of I exist.
It's an internal revolution. And every time the scriptures mention the Ob, it's a call to make that choice right now. Choose breath over fear. Choose oneness over separation. Choose awakened awareness over the familiar, hollow echo.
And that knowledge is so empowering. It takes the fear of external evil completely off the table.
It does.
Yeah.
And it replaces it with the responsibility of internal discernment. You have to examine the foundations of what you believe. Is the knowledge you operate from coming from a place of fullness, or is it just a recycled tradition that's spiritually bankrupt? Are you seeking guidance from a full wineskin, or are you just listening to the noise bouncing around an empty jar?
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. And what a complete redefinition. We've really moved the familiar spirit from the world of demons and witchcraft into the much more practical and vital world of psychological and spiritual discernment.
It's a lesson in personal accountability. The familiar spirits aren't demonic activity. They're a metaphor for living from the echoes of old, empty fears and traditions that keep our awareness separate from its source.
The solution isn't to go to war with them. The solution is to fill your own vessel.
Fill the vessel. That's it.
So the key takeaway for you, the listener, is this constant call to choose between fullness and hollowness. Every time you feel that pull of an old fear or an old superstition or an old sense of separation, you can recognize it for what it is. It's an invitation to wake up from the echo.
To stop consulting that hollow voice and to come back right here and now to the fullness of I exist consciousness.
So since the familiar spirit really just represents those familiar thoughts and patterns we're also used to, here's our provocative thought for you to take with you this week. We want to encourage you to actively monitor your own ruling awareness for the next 7 days. Ask yourself this question: what foundational idea that I operate from feels the most familiar?
It could be a belief about your worth or your health or your finances or your relationships, something that just feels like a default setting.
And once you've identified it, test it. Ask, does this familiar thought feel like a resonant voice of I exist? Does it feel grounded and true and full?
Or does it feel like a hollow, inherited echo? A ghost from the past, just bouncing around an empty chamber inside you. Really pay attention to the source of your anxieties this week. Are they truly grounded in your present reality, or are they just reruns of an old, dusty movie being projected onto an empty screen?
Until next time, cease from the noise and keep filling that vessel with the voice of breath.